This now, 30 years to the day that one of South Africa's most popular political leaders, as we said, Chris Hani, was assassinated. And the murder back in 1993 almost plunged the country into civil war and saw then ANC President Nelson Mandela engaging in tough talks to calm the nation down. Let's speak to Justice Malala, author of The Plot to Save South Africa, a book about the assassination of his aftermath. You know what, Justice, taking in all of this, because you, 10th of April 1993, you were there, you were a rookie journalist, and you're one of the first people on the crime scene when this happened. I can't even imagine, being 22 years old, basically being thrown into the deep end with this whole story. This is where it probably all began for you and inspired, maybe you didn't know back then, but the writing of this book.
Yeah, indeed. But to the point that Mangoba and his guests and the clips that he showed, it's also, I think all of us are still seeking questions, are still asking what really happened that day. And so for me, as a kid journalist, I arrive and I sit there and I say, what's going on? And I write up what I've got, and other senior journalists take over the story and so forth. But I've always wanted to go back, and I listened to Solima Paila saying, what was really behind what happened to Chris Hani. I think those questions remain. I think the big issue for all of us is, why has the ANC in power for 29 years not done anything more if there are so many questions still pending about this?
Yeah, and we are talking here about, of course, a man who helped direct the ANC's armed struggle. Clearly, his followers could have caused trouble back then.
Yeah, I think there's two sides to that. First of all, there are the people who loved, absolutely adored Chris Hani, people in eNCA, young people like myself. In the late 1980s, sociologists at vets and other institutions referred to young people of that generation as the lost generation. And that's because people had not had any education or had their education disrupted in the 1980s due to states of emergency, unrest, and so forth and so forth. So when Chris Hani came back from exile, he was the one ANC leader who could speak to these young people, who gave them an idea of a future that had a place for them in it. Chris Hani could charm, could command, could lead these young people, and his murder and his murderers like Janus Valus, Clive W. Lewis, wanted to use that to spark a war in South Africa. So you had that on the one side, and you had the right wing on the other side. The right wing was ecstatic. They wanted war. They wanted young people to get angry, to riot, and they wanted the army to take F.W. de Klerk out and to essentially reset South Africa to 1980, 1988, to apartheid and all that it entailed. So that was the leadership challenge of that day when Nelson Mandela, F.W. de Klerk, all these leaders got the call that Chris Hani had been murdered. This was where South Africa was. And I think the key lesson is, what do leaders do? How does leadership respond to moments of huge, massive crisis like this? And that day was not just the day after and the day after was crisis personified, because Nelson Mandela faced the right wing on the one hand, pushing for more conflict. You had the militants within the ANC, and you had angry young people who were saying, how do we deal with something like this when our leaders are being murdered? And so the tensions were high, the crisis was immense, and good leadership was what was needed at that time.
And many of those young people you just mentioned, many of them still believe that Chris Hani would have made a better leader, and a leader that South Africa desperately needs.
I think today, next year at this time, over the past 10, 15, 20 years, I think what Chris Hani has done, and his name and his messages before he was murdered, is to hold the ANC to account and to hold actually all of us South Africans to make us ask what happened to your country, what happened to you, South Africa, because the key question is how can so much go wrong? How can the inequality, the unemployment, the poverty continue when every 10th of April we stand up like Solima Paila did today, like so many other of these ANC leaders stood up today and say, oh, long live the spirit of Chris Hani. It doesn't live here. It doesn't live here at all. A huge chunk of what we have become is what Chris Hani warned against, and we're living through that. And I think it's an indictment on the current administration.
You know, there's a lot of talk about the tripartite alliance, like Mangoba also mentioned earlier, and there's a lot of faith being lost, or it seems like, from the SAPC side in the ANC and the tripartite alliance. But what do you think is the possibility of, you know, like many say now, or they are guessing that maybe the SACP could you know, go to the polls as an entity on its own? Do you think that is wise? Do you think it could be a possibility? It's just speculation, of course.
It's speculation. It's speculation that's been set off by the SACP itself. But, you know, the SACP has been beating this drum forever. Whenever there are problems under Thabo Mbeki, the SACP said the same thing. Under Jacob Zuma, the SACP said the same thing. They're making the same noises now. But come 2024, the SACP will go to the polls, in my view, with the ANC, and will support the ANC. So I'm not convinced by all this talk. I don't think it's going to happen. The SACP has become exactly what Chris Hani said it would become. Comrades who go into government to enrich themselves, and many of them have. It is a joke to actually say the SACP does not have power. If you look at Cyril Ramaphosa's cabinet or Jacob Zuma's cabinet, you will count Ebrahim Patel, you will count Gweda Mantashe, who used to be the national chairman of the ANC. You will see Blade Nzimande, the former secretary general of the ANC, Tula Sinesi. All these people sit in the central committee of the SACP and say one thing and go into the cabinet of Cyril Ramaphosa or whoever is in charge at that point and say totally another thing. So today you have Solima Paila saying, we've been for 30 years asking for an inquest into the death of Chris Hani. The same people that he sits with in the central committee of the SA Communist Party go to government and pretend that they have no power. What we've seen for 30 years is the misuse of power, the abuse of power to do something, if there is something to be done about the death of Chris Hani. So I quite frankly, all these pronouncements, I'll put it this way to you, Baron. This is a sham. These guys, these leaders, so-called leaders of the ANC and SACP, have had a chance their entire past 30 years to do something, or to have something done about these rumors and allegations about Chris Hani's murder. They have done nothing about it. They blame the Constitution that they themselves wrote. They blame Raymond Zondo, who they themselves appointed to enforce and to interpret the Constitution that they themselves wrote. So quite frankly, these are people who pretend that they don't have power. They have all the power to do exactly what they need to see done. And any kind of talk about, oh, you know, this is the Constitution and so forth, it's absolutely untrue, absolutely wrong. They're pretending they don't have power, which they have in abundance.
Coming back to the book, Justice, I mean, you know, when you write about someone like Chris Hani, you have to be quite fearless, because he was a fearless leader. And like we just heard from you, it does sound like you are a fearless man when it comes to your opinion on certain things. But do you think that, you know, or let me rather ask you this, what were some of the key takeaways for you when you were writing this book about Chris Hani? What are some of the key things that we need to know about Chris Hani and his ambitions and his outlook for South Africa?
Yeah, I think Chris Hani was one of the very best of the ANC. It's no mistake that he is so admired, so that even today there are people who go out there and remember him, remember what he said, and so forth. It's not just to mythologize him, it's because his entire life he stood for the ordinary man. He stood for the downtrodden. So he was born to a very poor family in a very poor area in Kofimvaba, a village called Sabalele. That's where a lot of the time you found him referring to that place as the roots of his closeness to the working class, to the poor, to people who are striving to make themselves better. He goes to Fort Hare, goes to Rhodes University, gets his degree, then goes to Cape Town and works in a law firm helping workers. So this is the trajectory through Chris Hani. Poor people, workers who are facing terrible conditions under apartheid, then goes into exile, becomes one of the first ANC cadres to go into Zimbabwe to start fighting the colonial regime there, and in that way join up with the ANC and the fight against apartheid. He gets arrested, he goes back and stands up for MK cadres in the camps, and therefore rises and rises. But throughout that career, you see a man who stands up, who is fearless against standing up against his own and standing up against the regime. In the 1960s, he wrote a letter to the leadership of the ANC saying, you're not treating ordinary ANC members in camps correctly. And there was a point when he was being threatened with the death penalty by the ANC, and he still stood firm. And that is Chris Hani. Throughout his life, that's been the motif of his life.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. We could speak for hours about the great leader that he was, Chris Hani. But thank you so much for your time. That, of course, author of The Plot to Save South Africa, Justice Malala, speaking to us live from the USA.